Well, good evening. I greatly appreciate Mr. Sam for giving me another opportunity to come out and present a lesson to y'all tonight. Tonight's topic will be centered around trials and tribulations. The definition of trials is a test of the performance qualities of someone or something. The definition for tribulation is a cause or state of great suffering. Have y'all ever had trials or tribulations? I can't really think of one for me. I'm still relatively young, but I know they're coming. Maybe the passing of a loved one, or maybe a hard time at work, or financial instability. Everybody has or will endure suffering at some point in their life. But how are we going to face it? Who or what are we going to turn to when we face these hard times? Tonight, I want to look at an example of a person who faced trials and tribulations and how they dealt with them. If you will, please turn to Genesis 37. Genesis 37, and we'll begin in verse 12. Now, this is a story about Joseph. Joseph was one of 12 brothers from Jacob. In verse 12, now his brothers went in the pasture, their father's flock, near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, Here I am. So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron and came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And a man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into the pit. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him from their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into the pit here in the wilderness. Do not lay a hand upon him, that he might rescue him from their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, from their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let none of our hand be upon him. For he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. The Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Here you see Joseph, a 17-year-old kid in the house of 12 siblings, and his father Jacob. Jacob loved Joseph more than any other brother. Joseph's brothers were very jealous of Jacob and the way that he treated Joseph. Now, And in verse 18, you can see that clearly they had enough of their brother to the point where they conspired to kill him. And verse 21, they didn't end up killing him. They end up sparing his life and throwing him into the pit. And he ends up getting sold into slavery into Egypt. This was one of the many trials that Joseph had to endure. From being thrown into a pit by his own brothers to being sold into slavery, it had to be pretty harsh for him. I know that if that were me, I wouldn't know what to do. I'd probably feel betrayed. I'd probably feel like this was very unfair. Joseph hadn't done anything to his brothers in order for them to treat him like this. But the scriptures don't show him complaining, and they don't show him going against his brothers. Joseph shows his patience in this trial, even when his brothers seek to do evil against him and seek to kill him. He didn't complain or ask God why he did all these things. He simply went along with what happened, and God was with him because of it. But what does the Bible say about patience? Please turn to James 1. James 1 and verse 2 through 3. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. James here talks about how trials are the testing of your faith and will produce patience. Just showing how Joseph, even going through his trials, produced patience through his trial and tribulation. My next point is how Joseph made the best out of the situation that he was in. Please turn to Genesis 39. Genesis 39, verses 1 through 6. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him from the Israelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph and became a very successful man, and he was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. You see, Joseph is a slave in Egypt and in the house of Potiphar, even though he was in slavery and away from his family. He was a hard worker and found favor in Potiphar's sight. Through his hard work and having God with him, Potiphar entrusted him in everything as overseer of the house and all of his possessions. Here you see that Joseph turned his trial of being enslaved and away from his family to be able to work hard and make a name for himself. If you go down to verse 20, before you get into this verse, you see that Jacob was a very handsome man. Potiphar's wife saw that, And she tells him to lie with him. And Joseph says no multiple times. Multiple times this happened. And the last time he said no, but he flees and leaves his garment. Potiphar's wife then goes to Potiphar and tells him a lie that says Joseph tried to sleep with her. Now in verse 20 through 23, it says, "And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord make it succeed." You see, Joseph is thrown into prison for nothing. You know, a lie was told against him. And if that were me, again, this false claims, thrown into prison for nothing. And you also got to think in this time, the prison of that particular time, it's not like the prison today. There's probably mud floor, probably a hole to use the bathroom in. Like you got to think these were really, really nasty conditions that he was in. And so, you know, you would have seen complaining. For me at least, I would have been complaining. I would have been like, "Hey, y'all threw me in this for nothing. I haven't done anything." What did he do while he was in prison? He made the best of what he had. And God was with him. No matter how unfair this was to Joseph or how wronged he showed favor in the sight of God, and God was with him. Now, when we have trials and tribulations, are we going to make the worst or the best of what we have? Please turn to Matthew 7. Matthew 7, starting verse 24. And it says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat on the house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Are we going to be like the wise man who built his house on the rock, which is God and his word? And when the trials and tribulations come, are we going to stand firm? Are we going to build our faith on God? Or are we going to be like the foolish man who didn't build his faith on God and didn't believe in God? And when trials and tribulations come, are we going to make things worse? Are we going to give up whenever these hard times come through? My third point I want to make is he had endurance. Joseph showed great endurance in his time of trials and tribulations. At the time Joseph was sold into slavery, he was just 17 years old. And by the time he was out of prison, he's about 30 years old. If you do the math, you can see that Joseph was in slavery and in prison for 13 years. So that pretty hefty time that he was in this trial and in time of tribulation. I know personally, for me, I probably couldn't be in jail for a little over than a week. I couldn't imagine being, especially with Joseph being wrongfully convicted. But here Joseph had even a worse condition that we have today in jails, but he also spent at least 2 years that we know in jail. And he still didn't complain, but he focused on doing God's work and helping other people out. What does the Bible say about having endurance? Please turn to Hebrews 10. Hebrews 10 and verse 36. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. This verse talks about how we have the need for endurance to go through life and during trials that we will have. That when we do God's will, that we will have the promise, and that is the promise to have a home in heaven. If you will turn to Romans 5. Romans 5 and Romans 5 and verse 3. It says, obtain access by the faith into the grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of glory of God. That was verse 2. Verse 3, not only that we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. This verse again shows us that we should glory in tribulations, because trials and tribulations produce endurance. And that is what happened to Joseph. Although he had trials and tribulations, he endured them and endured those for several years. Lastly, I want to look at how Joseph gave God the glory and how he helped him throughout his trials and tribulations. If you will turn back to Genesis, in Genesis 41. Genesis 41, verse 15, 16. Potiphar said to Joseph, I had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that you hear a dream and can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. At this time, Pharaoh calls for the wise men of the city, and he has this dream, and none of them are able to interpret his dream. The chief butler says that there was a young Hebrew that interpreted his dream. And then after that, Pharaoh inquires of him. Joseph simply doesn't take all the credit. He's already interpreted all these dreams, and he doesn't say, I've interpreted these dreams, and so yeah, I'll interpret this one because I have the power to do this. But he says, it is not in me, but God who can interpret yours. Another example, chapter 45 of Genesis in verse 5. This is when Joseph appears to his brothers, and he tells them he is their brother. Verse 5, he says, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God has sent me before you to preserve life." Joseph shows that he thanked God for putting him in the situation where he could help out Egypt. And lastly, in Genesis 50, Genesis 50 and verse 20, it says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it out that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Joseph gave God glory in everything that he was put through. Joseph showed that even though he was put through everything, from being sold into slavery, being thrown in his pit and sold into slavery by his brothers, being thrown in prison, God meant it for good. Now, when we are going through trials and tribulations, are we giving God the glory? That even though we went through that time of suffering, are we giving God the glory that he put us through that time, that we might be able to share it with others? How God has helped us out through the hard times in life. We can see through Joseph and plenty of others in the Bible that trials and tribulations are coming. Everybody will endure trials and tribulations. Are we equipped to face them? And finally, even though we are going through trials and tribulations, that when we get through them, are we giving God the glory in those times of suffering? I hope this lesson tonight has been beneficial to you. Have you ever been baptized and cleansed of your sins? Do you have the full conviction to know that if you died tonight, that you would hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? Or have you been saved and not walked that life that is acceptable to God? I'm sure that there are plenty of brothers and sisters that will talk to you and pray for you. If you're in any need of the gospel in any way, why don't you come now as we stand and as we sing?